Between the time when the oceans drank Atlantis and the rise of the sons of Arius, there was an age undreamed of. And unto this, Conan, destined to bear the jeweled crown of Aquilonia upon a troubled brow. It is I, his chronicler, who alone can tell thee of his saga. Let me tell you of the days of high adventure.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Conan Chronicles. This is Dan, your host, and the subject of today's review and retrospective is the 8th story in Conan's publication history, The Frost Giant's Daughter. This story was penned by Robert E. Howard and published for the first time in the March 1934 issue of the Fantasy Fan magazine. I started this episode with a grim but famous quote from Genghis Khan that's paraphrased in the first Conan the Barbarian film.
Wrong! Conan, what is best in life? To crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and to hear the lamentation of their women. That is good.
I did this because this story in particular is one that reveals to us the monster that dwells within the psyche of every human being. And there are few better historical examples of a man who embodied all of humanity's wickedness than Genghis Khan. He also happens to be one of the primary inspirations for the creation of Conan by Howard in the first place, and when he was adapted into film for the first time. Conan is definitely less possessed by psychopathy and megalomania than the Great Khan in his usual adventures, but in this story, we get to see that darkness that lurks in his psyche come to the forefront after the Cimmerian is enthralled by an evil spell. Before the events of the story, Conan had signed up to fight as a mercenary in a conflict between two warring factions. The both Viking-esque Aesir and Vanir tribes had been locked in a war for domination of the frozen land of Nordheim, far to the north of even Conan's native land, Cimmeria. Conan is fighting on the side of the Aesir, and when we first meet him, he's knee-deep in a frosty sea of blood and corpses. The battle between Conan's Aesir allies and the Vanir war party had ended in a virtual stalemate. Both armies are decimated at the start of the story, with only Conan and a Vanir warrior named Heimdall left to decide who would win the battle. After exchanging some sharp words, the battle-weary warriors lock eyes. Heimdall leaps at the Cimmerian, smashing his head with a blow that would have cleaved Conan's skull in half if it weren't for his helmet. The dazed barbarian staggers, but still manages to recover enough of his consciousness to drive his blade through the Vanir, ending his life and the bloody conflict. Conan immediately collapses in the snow, exhausted from hours of deadly combat and the blow to his head, which causes him to go blind temporarily. During a spell of momentary blackness in his vision, a chilling sound cuts through the silence of the killing field.
A silvery laugh cut through his dizziness, and his sight cleared slowly. He looked up. Before him, swaying like a sapling in the wind, stood a woman. Her body was like ivory to his dazed gaze, and save for a light veil of gossamer, she was naked as the day. Her slender, bare, white feet were whiter than the snow they spurned. His gaze went again to her unruly locks, which at first glance he had thought to be red. Now he saw that they were neither red nor yellow, but a glorious compound of both colours. He gazed, spellbound. Her hair was like elfin gold. The sun struck it so dazzlingly that he could scarcely bear to look upon it. Her eyes were likewise neither wholly blue nor wholly grey, but of shifting colours and dancing lights and clouds of colours he could not define. Her full red lips smiled, and from her slender feet to the blinding crown of her billowy hair, her ivory body was as perfect as the dream of a god. Conan's pulse hammered in his temples. She laughed down at the bewildered warrior. Her laughter was sweeter than the rippling of silvery fountains, and poisonous with cruel mockery.
This pale-skinned beauty, who walks with the grace of a goddess, is Atali, daughter of the frost giant king Ymir, and the subject of horrifying legends told in whispers amongst the Aesir and Vanir people. It is said by the various tribes of Nordheim that the wicked giantess appears as an apparition amongst the remnants of bloody battles. She scours the blood-stained wastelands for any warriors who still manage to cling to life. Atali then enchants them with her exotic beauty and laughter, sweeter than the music from the finest harp. Any warrior unlucky enough to set their eyes upon Atali's body and hear her gorgeous laughter falls under a spell of unquenchable lust and rage. All battle fatigue and concern for injury melts from the minds of her enthralled warriors, and they pursue Atali as she leads them into a trap. Her ultimate design is to lead warriors to a place where they can be dealt a gruesome death by her brothers, two frost giants, who seek to rip the beating hearts out of Atali's victims so they can be presented, red and still smoking in the frozen air, to their father, Ymir, who demands this as a ritual sacrifice. When Atali finds Conan, lying in a blind, crumpled heap in the snow amongst the dead, she mocks him, laughing heartily into the frigid winds. As Conan hears her laughter, his vision returns, and he lays eyes upon perhaps the most gorgeous woman he's ever seen in his life. It's at that very moment that Atali knows she's captured the mind of the broken warrior before her.
"Who are you?" asked the Cimmerian. "Whence came you?" "What matter?" Her voice was more musical than a silver-stringed harp, but it was edged with cruelty. "Call up your men," said he, grasping his sword. "Yet, though my strength fail me, they shall not take me alive. I see you are of the Vanir." "Have I said so?" "I cannot tell," said he, "whether you are of Vanaheim and mine enemy, or of Asgard and my friend. Far I have wandered, but a woman like you I have never seen. Your locks blind me with their brightness. Never have I seen such hair, not even among the fairest daughters of the Aesir. By Ymir." "Why, who are you to swear by Ymir?" she mocked. "What know you of the gods of ice and snow, you who have come up from the south to adventure among an alien people?" "By the dark gods of my own race," he cried in anger. "Tell me, woman, have you seen the flash of mail out across the snow plains, or seen armed men moving upon the ice?" "I have seen the hoarfrost glittering in the sun," she answered. "I have heard the wind whispering across the everlasting snows." I had thought there was no village within many leagues of this spot, for the war carried us far, but you cannot have come a great distance over these snows, naked as you are. Lead me to your tribe, if you are of Asgard, for I am faint with blows and the weariness of strife. My village is further than you can walk, Conan of Cimmeria, she laughed. Spreading her arms wide, she swayed before him, her golden head lolling sensuously, her scintillant eyes half-shadowed beneath their long silken lashes. Am I not beautiful, O man? Like dawn running naked on the snows, he muttered, his eyes burning like those of a wolf. Then why do you not rise and follow me? Who is the strong warrior who falls down before me? She chanted in maddening mockery. Lie down and die in the snow with the other fools, Conan of the black hair. You cannot follow where I would lead.
A mixture of bestial rage at Atali's mockery and an extreme carnal desire for her gorgeous body floods through the Cimmerian's veins. Conan leaps at her, attempting to grip her icy cold flesh in his lusty hands. But before he can reach her, the giantess shrieks with laughter and darts away, running out into the frozen wasteland beyond the killing field.
Out across the white blinding plain the chase led. The trampled red field fell out of sight behind him, but still Conan kept on with the silent tenacity of his race. He had forgotten the fight, forgotten the mailed warriors who lay in their blood, forgotten Njord and the reavers who had failed to reach the fight. He had thought only for the slender white shape which seemed to float rather than run before him. His mailed feet broke through the frozen crust. He sank deep into the drifts and forged through them by sheer strength. But the girl danced across the snow light as a feather floating across a pool. Her naked feet barely left their imprint on the hoarfrost that overlaid the crust. In spite of the fire in his veins, the cold bit through the warrior's mail and fur-lined tunic, but the girl in her gossamer veil ran as lightly and as gaily as if she danced through the palm and rose gardens of Poitain. On and on she led, and Conan followed. Black curses drooled through the Cimmerian's parched lips. The great veins in his temples swelled and throbbed, and his teeth gnashed. "You cannot escape me," he roared. "Lead me into a trap, and I'll pile the heads of your kinsmen at your feet. Hide from me, and I'll tear apart the mountains to find you. I'll follow you to hell." Her maddening laughter floated back to him, and foam flew from the barbarian's lips.
Possessed by the base, monstrous, and ancient instincts of the human psyche, Conan trudges on through the snow. He follows the object of his desire for a while, until they finally reach Atali's hulking brothers, who had been waiting for her to return with prey.
"Brothers!" cried the girl, dancing between them. "Look who follows! I have brought you a man to slay. Take his heart, that we may lay it smoking on our father's board." The giants answered with roars like the grinding of icebergs on a frozen shore, and heaved up their shining axes as the maddened Cimmerian hurled himself upon them. A frosty blade flashed before his eyes, blinding him with its brightness, and he gave back a terrible stroke that sheared through his foe's thigh. With a groan, the victim fell, and at the instant Conan was dashed into the snow, his left shoulder numb from the blow of the survivor, from which the Cimmerian's mail had barely saved his life. Conan saw the remaining giant looming high above him like a colossus carved of ice, etched against the cold, glowing sky. The axe fell to sink through the snow and deep into the frozen earth as Conan hurled himself aside and leaped to his feet. The giant roared and wrenched his axe free, but even as he did, Conan's sword sang down. The giant's knees bent, and he sank slowly into the snow, which turned crimson with the blood that gushed from his half-severed neck. Conan wheeled to see the girl standing a short distance away, staring at him in wide-eyed horror, all the mockery gone from her face. She cried out fiercely, and the blood drops flew from his sword as his hand shook in the intensity of his passion. "Call the rest of your brothers," he cried. "I'll give their hearts to the wolves. You cannot escape me.
When Atali's second brother falls, the barbarian shrieks into the heavens, with an equal measure of unbridled rage and malevolent lust for her in his voice. The giantess's expression shifts from a gleeful grin at Conan's impending doom to a mouth wide open, frozen in sheer terror. She turns quickly and sprints away from the monster that had before lied dormant in the barbarian's heart. She had thought Conan to be prey. Instead, she got much more than she bargained for with this warrior. Now, she was the hunted. The barbarian leaps after her like a rabid dog, and fueled by his rank sexual desire and rage, he eventually chases her long enough for the giantess to grow tired. As her endurance fades, the beast gets closer and closer until he leaps at her with a primal roar. Conan lands on top of her, pinning her underneath his gigantic frame, and tears at her flesh with an iron grasp. Atali writhes in horror as Conan attempts to rape her. Never before had Atali been forced to face this dark, horrific aspect she routinely brought out in the human spirit. This was supposed to be a ruse, meant to trick these easily manipulated mortals, still shackled by the instincts of a primitive mind barely evolved beyond savagery. With the desperate strength of a woman fighting for her survival and dignity, Atali manages to wriggle out from under Conan's colossal body and runs with all of her remaining strength away from the Cimmerian. As she slips away, Conan roars and grasps the beautiful gossamer veil sitting atop her head. He continues on after her, like an unstoppable machine programmed for a single purpose, gaining ground once again on the beautiful figure just ahead of him. Just as the beast is about to catch her again, the giantess throws her arms into the air and gazes into the heavens. She screams desperately for her father, Ymir, to save her from this abominable creature she had created with her enchantment. Suddenly, Atali is engulfed by a flash of icy blue fire, and Conan is knocked unconscious by the blast. After some time, the Cimmerian feels his body being shaken awake, and the murmuring of Aesir reinforcements who had come to assist Conan's war party fills his ears. Conan awakens and tells the soldiers of what he experienced. Many of them are skeptical, suggesting that Conan must have been dreaming after collapsing from battle fatigue. However, an older, wiser soldier comes forward and tells Conan of the legends of Atali, and that she is the one who he must have encountered out in the frozen wasteland. The skeptical warriors chortle at the old man's superstitious nature, before Conan looks down at his still tightly clenched fist. In his hand, Conan grips a gossamer veil with all of his strength, the one he had thought he'd ripped from Atali's head as she escaped him. The story ends with the barbarian and his warrior companions gazing in shock at the veil. Conan was holding proof that the legends told to scare the Aesir at night as children were true after all. The Frost Giant's Daughter is a very short story, even for a story in this short story sort of medium. It's only 3,000 words, and the audiobook version I listened to is just over 20 minutes long. Despite its short length, I think that Howard manages to spin a very compelling story here. It's a story about the darkness that lurks within the psyche of all human beings, born of our past as primates who had to fight against nature daily to survive. One of the most famous philosophers in the history of the discipline, a German man who lived during the 19th century named Friedrich Nietzsche, articulated a psychological concept in his writings called the beast within. If Nietzsche's name sounds familiar to you, you may know him because the 1982 Conan the Barbarian film opens with a quote from Nietzsche's writing. That which does not kill us makes us stronger. Nietzsche, for better or for worse, thought that humanity had strayed much too far from what he called this beast within. He thought that humans in his day had shunned the unconscious, instinctual, and animalistic aspects of their psyche in favor of relying on their conscious perception of the world to lead them. He thought that the highly repressive, moralistic nature of 19th century European culture was unnatural and stifling of humanity's true potential as a species. He advocated for a return of integrating these dark aspects of the human psyche into our culture. He admitted that this was an extremely dangerous proposition, as these animalistic drives can be very destructive if the individual doesn't have the discipline to wield them. He once said, quote, "You aspire to free heights. Your soul thirsts for the stars, but your wicked instincts too thirst for freedom. Your wild dogs want freedom. They bark with joy in the cellar when your spirit plans to open all prisons." Nietzsche believed it was impossible for humanity to rid ourselves of these dark desires, the will to power, the desire to murder one's enemies, to have our way with anyone we wish sexually, etc. He viewed contemporary society in his day this way, quote, "Society tames the wolf into a dog, and man is the most domesticated animal of all." Nietzsche thought that without humanity freeing ourselves from this domestication, this extreme societal pressure to repress what humanity really is, there will be nothing but the same failed cultural ideas and experiments recycled until our eventual doom. He believed that the reason ancient empires, like the ancient city-states of Greece, pioneered many of the political ideas that shape the modern world, is because they allowed themselves the freedom to integrate this darkness into their culture. For in his view, one cannot create a system that effectively governs men without having an understanding of what we are. Nietzsche spoke of festivals in ancient Greece devoted to all their passions and evil inclinations, which served as culturally sanctioned mechanisms to help the Greeks transform their primal passions into a productive cultural force. Whether you agree with all of Nietzsche's points on the nature of humanity is up to you. I'm not sure that I do, but it's definitely interesting to think about. Of course, the ancient Greeks didn't limit their ugliness to the confines of festivals and ceremonies, however. I've spoken before about how Conan is partially based on, and reminds me of, various great conquerors and warriors of history. Alexander the Great, perhaps the most famous warrior king produced by ancient Greek civilization, was known to treat his enemies very harshly. In the ancient Mediterranean world, the Greek empires before Alexander's reign and the Romans who came after him viewed the rape of women as socially acceptable behavior within the rules of war. For thousands of years, armies marched out from the Greek and Italian peninsulas to find plunder and take foreign women as wives, concubines, slaves, and trophies. Ancient civilizations rarely saw any reason to apply moralistic pretexts to their campaigns of theft and conquest, as modern civilizations often do. The famous Roman historian and politician Cicero, portrayed as an old and wise dissenter of Julius Caesar in Shakespeare's play on the assassination of the Roman dictator, often spoke of stealing the riches, property, and women of foreign men alone as a legitimate, if not the most legitimate, reason to wage an offensive war. In The Frost Giant's Daughter, we see a Conan that has what little civilized, conscious control he has over his primal lust and rage stripped from him. To use Nietzsche's analogy, the dogs trapped in the dark, horrific basement of Conan's mind were unshackled, completely consumed by his base, instinctual savagery. The barbarian becomes a lustful, angry monster. The scenes where Conan is possessed by the evil within him are genuinely horrific. I found it pretty difficult to read the scenes where he almost rapes Atali, but I think that's kind of the point. Howard doesn't glorify Conan or his actions. He bluntly presents them as they are. Howard is hardly the first writer to tell a story about such things. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde deals with many of the same themes of a beast that lurks within the human spirit. And more contemporary stories, like The Shining, A Clockwork Orange, Dr. Strangelove, Full Metal Jacket, 2001: A Space Odyssey, Eyes Wide Shut. Well, I guess a lot of, if not all of, Kubrick's filmography. Can you tell that I'm a fan? Most of his movies are about these sorts of themes. I'm also a big fan of Star Wars, which also portrays the dark side of the human psyche as a thing to be feared and resisted, because it twists people into some monstrous version of themselves, unrecognizable to those they once called friends and family. The last example of this that came to my mind that's sort of similar is The Incredible Hulk, and I mean like the comic book Hulk and the Lou Ferrigno Bill Bixby TV show Hulk, where Bruce Banner is a tragic figure who can't control the instinctual bestial rage inside him and turns into an uncontrollable monster. Howard certainly wasn't the first author or the last one to write about these sorts of things. The horrible things people are capable of fascinate humanity just as much as the amazing things we're capable of. These types of stories can be useful cautionary tales, legends that help you stray from a similar path in life. What Howard brings to his version of this story that tackles this theme about the dark side of humanity is a historical realism wrapped in the trappings of mythology. One of the primary influences for Conan's character in the original stories and on film when he was adapted for the screen by Oliver Stone and John Milius is Genghis Khan. In June of 1986, an English professor named Charlotte Laughlin gave a speech at a Robert E. Howard convention because she was the conservator of the Robert E. Howard Memorial Collection at the time. This is a series of writings and books that were owned by Howard, which he eventually donated to his alma mater, Howard Payne University. During her speech at the convention, she described an encounter another student had with Howard in the library of Howard Payne University while he was a student there. Quote, "When Bob Howard was a student at Howard Payne University in Brownwood, Texas, a student at the adjoining Daniel Baker College was writing a paper on Genghis Khan. When this student learned that Howard was good in history, he asked Howard in the library what he knew about Genghis Khan. Howard proceeded to orate and even act out the life of the Mongol emperor. When, after 2 hours, Howard was asked how he knew so much about Genghis Khan, he bent close and replied, 'Because I was there,' and then, more forcefully, 'Because I was there.'" End quote. Genghis Khan was one of the historical figures that Howard knew the most about, and was clearly an influence on the characterization of Conan, and specifically I think this story as well. Atali's name is only a couple of letters switched around from the name of the Altai Mountains, which is a mountain range one of the Mongol tribes Khan united into his horde hailed from. On a more frightening note, Conan having enough bestial lust and rage within him to become a monstrous rapist upon provocation by a magic spell is not out of character for someone based on Genghis Khan. Khan was a fierce warrior, raised on the frozen steppes of Mongolia north of China. As a child, he was kidnapped and sold into slavery. After escaping, he united the disparate Mongol tribes into an army, which galloped out of the tundra to conquer the largest contiguous land empire in the recorded history of mankind. Despite being just a man, Genghis Khan was a hero to his people, and a figure of otherworldly horror to his enemies. The Mongols practiced the same brand of warfare that fierce warrior civilizations before them did, like the Greeks, Romans, and Vikings, whom Howard also took great inspiration from here, obviously, given that this is a Norse mythology story. Possessed by the sheer madness that war can create in the minds of men, the Mongol armies raped, pillaged and burned entire civilizations, leaving nothing but deserts of rubble where mighty imperial cities once flourished in their wake. Those who refused to be annexed as a tributary into the Great Khan's empire were completely decimated as an example of Genghis Khan's tolerance for disobedience. There are many accounts which detail entire cities having just about every single citizen murdered, men, women, and children. The Mongols smashed or burned every single building to the ground to intimidate other potential resistors to the Mongol army. Towers, pyramids, and sometimes even walls of skulls, numbering in the thousands, were left surrounding some of these cities as monuments to the Khan's wrath. The few women he did not murder, he took for himself or awarded them as prizes to his men. The emperor fathered so many children, either by one of his many wives or concubines, or by rape during conquest, that a genetic study tracking Y chromosomes passed from fathers to sons over generations, published in 2003, concluded that 1 in 200 men living on planet Earth that year were related to Genghis Khan. By the time the Great Khan died in 1227, his bloody conquest across Asia and Eastern Europe had resulted in the slaughter of approximately 40 million people. For context, this was around 10% of the world's population at that time. To this day, Genghis Khan is revered by native Mongolians as the founding father of their nation, in the same way that Americans view someone like George Washington, also a mighty warrior who shed blood to found his nation. To Mongolians, Genghis Khan is a man of great strength, who brought imperial glory to a tribe of backwater nomads from the frozen Eurasian steppes. To his enemies, he was a genocidal maniac who wrought nothing but brutality and oppression upon them. Learning about Genghis Khan certainly paints a very bleak picture about the nature of humanity. You know, how we've developed and what exactly living as a warrior does to the human psyche. But I really think that examining people like Genghis Khan is important in understanding what exactly humans are. Our protagonist in this story is a man named Conan, a warrior born and bred. The way he wages war is very different than how we do today, but the state of mind he has to enter to be a warrior is still the same. To be an effective warrior, one has to place themselves in a state of mind many civilized people wouldn't regard as positive. They say, if you stare into the abyss of the dark aspects of the human psyche, it may begin to stare back into you. Oliver Stone, the man who's largely responsible for the first Conan movie being made due to his initial script draft and interest in the character, experienced the life of a warrior firsthand. He fought in Vietnam for 2 years in the 1960s and left the US Army a distinguished soldier at the end of his time there. He knows very well that staring into the dark abyss of war changes even the most civilized people into something else, as they're forced to abandon morality in situations where the choice is effectively between survival and death.
I think, I went to Nam as a soldier eventually in 67, 8, and I saw things that just shocked me. Opened my eyes. I'd never be the same again. Combat is a searing experience and devastating to what your sense of life is worth and your sense of self. You have no illusions about yourself or what life comes down to. It comes to a very basic thing. Survival. And you see a lot of ugliness in your fellow man. And young people. I mean, it's a very genetic kind of thing. It just is breeded. It's an inbred thing. I try to deal with that in Platoon. at the lowest level, you see a certain type of man that's going to go a certain kind of way in a pressure situation. And other types of men are going to do better things, I think, morally better. So,
A clip of another Vietnam veteran I found from the same documentarian, I'll provide links to that in the description, by the way, also describes how war changes the way that people perceive each other and what people are capable of in a situation where their only goal is survival.
And then I was there for on the third day I was there, we were sent down to the tractor park, the amphibious tractor park, to meet a bunch of detainees. It was our responsibility to take care of prisoners, and detainees were a classification of civilians. They were not combatants. They could be detained for questioning. That's why they were called detainees. 2 tractors came in. They had a whole bunch of Vietnamese up on top. High, flat-topped vehicles, about 8 or 9 feet tall. And as the tracks wheeled into the park, the Marines up on top immediately began hurling these people off. They were bound hand and foot so that they had no way of breaking their falls. And they were old men, women, children, no young men. And I couldn't believe these guys were treating these people this way. And I turned to Jimmy and said, I grabbed him by the arm and said, what are those guys doing? We're supposed to be helping these people. And he said, Ehrhart, you better keep your mouth shut until you know what's going on around here. It went downhill from there. And again, I can't even begin to explain in the space of time that you have all of the things that went into it, but I began to understand, it became obvious that the enemy was the very people in these villages around us, and we were in a very heavily populated area at that time. They were the enemy, or at least the enemy was out there somewhere, and we couldn't tell one from another. And day after day, our patrols went out, and we ran into snipers and mines, and snipers and mines, and snipers and mines. I saw 4 armed enemy soldiers the first 8 months I was in Vietnam. And yet our battalion during that same period of time sustained 75 mining and sniping incidents per month, over half of them resulting in casualties. This is for a unit of about 1,000 men. But there was no one to fight back at. And you begin to think, these people are the enemy. They're all the enemy. And then you go through villages and, you get sniped at, and so you call an airstrike in on the village and the whole village goes up. Or you go through a place and you search it and you burn houses and blow them up. I began to understand why the Vietnamese didn't greet me with open arms, why they in fact hated me. But of course that didn't change the fact that my friends were getting killed and injured every day, and the only place that you could focus your own anger and fear was on those civilians who were there. And so it was this self-perpetuating mechanism. The longer that we stayed in Vietnam, the more Viet Cong there were. None of that distilled itself into the clear kind of expression that I'm presenting now. Turned out not to be quite so easy to forget it, but that was the notion. And certainly for my last 8-9 months in Vietnam, I ceased to think. I quite literally ceased to think about why I was there or what I was doing. The sole purpose for my being in Vietnam at that point was to stay alive until I could get out. And the reason for that is that, the kinds of questions that began to present themselves were just, the questions themselves were ugly. And I didn't want to know the answers. It's like banging on a door. You knock on a door, and the door opens slightly, and behind that door it's dark, and there's loud noises coming, like there's wild animals in there or something. And you peer into the darkness and you can't see what's there, but you can hear all this ugly stuff. You want to step into that room? No way. You just sort of back out quietly, pull the door shut behind you, and walk away from it. And that's what was going on. The questions themselves were too ugly to even ask, let alone try to deal with the answers. The people hated me. The Vietnamese people hated me. And it was that was perfectly clear. I mean, people didn't say good morning to you. People didn't, I mean, people hated me. I know that some other people's experience was different, but in my own experience, the Vietnamese people hated me, and I gave them every reason to hate me. I beat them. I sometimes killed them. I destroyed their houses. I destroyed their crops. I destroyed their fields. I destroyed their culture. Why in the hell should those people like me? And I could see that I was doing that.
The man you just saw speak is William Ehrhart, a poet and English school teacher who became something he before wouldn't have recognized when put in the brutal conditions of Vietnam. Whether we'd like to admit it or not, the bestial instincts that were instrumental in the rise of humanity from hunter-gatherer nomads all the way to modern civilization still exist within us. And if provoked, they can be horrifying. Even a gentle soul like Ehrhart, a schoolteacher and poet, one who you'd usually associate with normal civilized existence, carries a rabid beast inside his heart. Now imagine a man born into a world that's in a constant state of war, who was born during a battle, who fought desperately for survival as a hunter-gatherer every day and spent his entire life living as a warrior. What would a man be like who doesn't just spend a few years in Vietnam, but spends an entire lifetime slaying and conquering? This is Conan. War is his trade. He, like Genghis Khan, grew up in a frozen wasteland amongst a small clan of tribesmen. Genghis Khan's father was assassinated by a rival tribe at the age of 9. He and his wife were kidnapped and sold into slavery as teenagers. The Mongolian steppes were locked in constant warfare between the various nomadic tribes. Genghis Khan eventually escaped his slavery and established himself as a fearsome general before riding out of the steppes to conquer the world. Such also is the destiny of Conan, to ride out of the frozen wastes of Cimmeria and conquer a mighty empire. Conan is not usually portrayed as being completely consumed by his lust and rage. He is certainly a wild man and a warrior who kills for a living and doesn't appear interested in settling down with any single woman. However, we do get to see in various stories that Conan has genuine moments of compassion for women that he feels affection for. In The Slithering Shadow, Conan is shown not to be above lust, but he also shows loyalty and genuine care towards Natala in that story when Thalas attempts to seduce him. The thing is, though, Conan's also always described as a frightening creature at first glance, more like an animal than a man. This sort of bestial presence frightens the Princess Yasmela in Black Colossus at first, before she eventually falls for him at the end of the story. Conan is clearly not as evil and depraved a person as Genghis Khan was, but the capacity for savage evil is in him, like it is for all of us. It's like what Oliver Stone said here.
I agree that life is not just war. War is a part of evolution. But war is not just shooting at each other. Takes the form of making films, of making a living, of raising children, of being born, of dying. I go back to the concept that we have to find a way in ourselves to get peace. And I think that it is, the aggression in us is there, as Kubrick pointed out very clearly in 2001, and in Paths of Glory and Clockwork Orange and so forth. The aggression is definitely there. It's what you do to tame the beast in yourself that matters. It's a question of your character.
The capacity for extreme aggression lies within all of us. but it's how we deal with that aggression, that internal strife, is what builds the character of a human being. War is a particularly dark and potent experience. It tests the strength of people's belief in the morals they espouse. It doesn't often afford them the luxury to even think about such things. Conan was born in the middle of a war, hunted wild animals for food every day, bled to defend his people, and afterwards became a professional cutthroat. This is a man who often has little opportunity to consider morality, when the stakes are his victory or his death. Those kind of conditions can turn men into monstrous creatures, because that's often what they need to become to survive. For all of the things that humanity is not, we are definitely adaptable. Conan is presented in this story as a villainous presence almost from the start. He wins a battle that ultimately proves sort of useless and indecisive. Only one man from the winning army survived. That's hardly a stunning victory. When Atali finally finds him, she scolds him for murdering and destroying the culture of a foreign people in the interest of his own enrichment. When all of these bestial instincts that allowed him to thrive in the brutality of the life he's lived come to the surface, he's the scariest part of the story. He's portrayed like an animalistic, otherworldly creature, like the Hulk when Banner loses control of his rage. The thing that makes it even more frightening, however, is that while Conan is very disconnected from the modern world and our sense of what's right and what's wrong, he's not an otherworldly creature. He's a man. He's a human being. He's distinctly of our world. He's not a Lovecraftian monster. In fact, the scariest thing in the story is the human spirit, Conan, and the darkness that lies within the human psyche is the source of the Lovecraftian horror vibe that's usually present in these Conan stories. I think this sort of reversal is a really interesting choice, and unfortunately, this sort of behavior is in character for a warrior of the time and place Conan was born into. Conan is in some ways nobler than many of his historical counterparts, but he's hardly a paragon of virtue. For him to be so would be a fairy tale. It wouldn't be realistic. The circumstances of his life forged him into somewhat of a monster. He's a warrior, a thief, and a conqueror. The story reads to me like a mythic parable about the dark things in the human psyche that lead people to embark on campaigns of organized murder. Conan kills the last man on the battlefield and is tempted by the lust that exists within him, his lust for women, riches, and glory. After being scolded for these tendencies, Conan gives in to them, and his bestial nature almost gets him killed. However, by the end, his monstrousness and will to satiate his depraved desires is what saves his life. I don't think it's any coincidence that Howard chose to have this story take place directly after a bloody battle. It's almost as if Conan slips into a dream world, where he's forced to face just how much of a monster war has made him. But it also teaches him the lesson that these bestial instincts are what will keep him alive. The moral of the story may be that if people choose to fight each other, if we choose war, we may be horrified by the things we become in order to fight them. The story also read to me like a dark legend made to scare people from a similar fate, because Howard borrows the plot of this story, symbols, and even characters from Greek and Norse mythology. Most religious stories are designed to be concise morality plays for their followers. As a person who was raised in the Catholic Church, I can say that this is certainly one of the main things priests do, in at least the Roman Catholic version of Christianity. The teachings of Jesus are derived from the stories that we have about him, and more ancient people were no different in how they used mythological stories to guide their lives. Howard was a big fan of mythology, and when he sat down to pen The Frost Giant's Daughter, he sought to rewrite some of his favorite Greek myths in a way that was easily accessible for fans of adventure fiction. The first myth that he was very influenced by was the Greek legend of Apollo and Daphne. In that story, the god Apollo insults Cupid, the god of erotic love and desire, by telling him that he isn't a very good archer. Cupid is very petty, like most of the Greek gods, and decides that he wants to avenge this arrogant slight made against him. He resorts to shooting Apollo with one of his arrows of erotic desire. This arrow directs his affection towards a mortal woman named Daphne. Shortly thereafter, Cupid also shoots Daphne with an arrow that will make her completely repulsed by Apollo's advances. Apollo falls madly in love with Daphne and pursues her. This causes the mortal woman to flee from him in disgust. However, since she is only a mortal, she can't escape him. Just before Apollo is about to force himself on her, she calls out to her father for help. Her father, Peneus, is a powerful river god, and he transforms his daughter into a laurel tree, hoping to repel the love-stricken god with Daphne's new form. However, Cupid's spell is too strong. Apollo still proclaims his love for Daphne as a tree, and the maiden is horrified, as she's unable to escape him for all eternity, now rooted to the ground where he will always be able to find her. The plot of The Frost Giant's Daughter is obviously very similar. In both stories, we have a god and a mortal quarreling over one's unrequited affection for the other, but Howard reverses the roles in his version of it. Instead of Apollo, this story has a mortal man in Conan as the pursuer and figure of lustful horror, while Atali, the pursued, takes the role of the god, and sort of has a similar background to Daphne in that her father is also a deity. Atali even asks her father to intervene on her behalf, to save her from the mystified Conan at the end of the story. In Howard's story, Atali gets away instead of being stuck with Conan at the end for all eternity, like Daphne, so that's definitely good. Howard also, in his typical fashion, makes the story of Daphne and Apollo a bit bleaker and tinged with elements of horror, where the original didn't have quite the same flavor. Daphne is an innocent victim of Cupid's scheme in the fable. In Howard's version of the story, Atali is attempting to lure Conan to her brothers so that he can be slaughtered and used in a ritual sacrifice to her father. The other concept from Greek mythology that Howard uses in this story is a mythological creature called a siren. Sirens appear in many of the Greek myths. They usually wait at sea, on some uncharted island or rock, where they lure unsuspecting sailors in with their beauty and gorgeous singing voices. Sirens are one of the challenges that Odysseus encounters during Homer's epic poem, The Odyssey, as he travels home from the Trojan War. In contrast with their beauty, sirens are wicked creatures who wish to lure boats too close to their shores, crashing the sailors' boats and making them sink to a watery grave. Depending on which story you're reading, sirens appear usually as either a human-bird hybrid or they look like mermaids, which is of course a human-fish hybrid. Atali is basically a siren wrapped in a Norse mythological package. She's a frost giant's offspring who waits in the frozen tundra for Vikings to fall in battle, which is of course, I would expect, common in Nordheim, since these people are based on Viking raiders who raped, pillaged, and burned almost anything to earn a living. She then lures the unsuspecting warriors to where her brothers wait for their prey. It's very cool that Howard made her the daughter of Ymir, the king of the frost giants in Norse mythology, who I'm familiar with as a fan of the Marvel version of Thor. You can really tell reading this story that its Viking aesthetic and mythological underpinnings are precisely what inspired John Milius to direct the first Conan film. Milius kept many elements from the original script written by Oliver Stone, but His primary contribution was turning the film into as realistic a historical sword and sandal type epic as possible. He sought to make a film primarily inspired by Conan's connection to real history and his love of Vikings and other warrior tribes that existed throughout human history. The way Oliver Stone got Milius interested in making the movie in the first place was by telling him about the historical influence Howard brought to this Conan universe he had created. Both Milius and Stone share an interest in telling stories about warriors, and after the rewrites, they ended up making a movie about the life of Genghis Khan, wrapped in a Viking aesthetic as a Conan film. In the film, the two major changes to Conan's backstory are that his father dies when he's around 9, as Genghis Khan's did during his life, and afterwards Conan is sold into slavery, again as Genghis Khan was during the time he lived. Subotai, Conan's right-hand man in the film, is based on one of Genghis Khan's generals, which, of course, is one of Genghis Khan's right-hand men. The scene where Arnold is asked the question what he believes is best in life is also ripped directly out of a historical account of Genghis Khan. The account describes a scene in which Genghis Khan is sitting around with some of his generals when he asks them what they think the greatest joy in life is. One of his generals replies with only a slight variation of the lines spoken in the film. The open steppe, a fleet horse, falcons at your wrist, and the wind in your hair. I honestly don't think making Conan even more of a direct Genghis Khan analog is really that bad of a choice. You can see here in this clip from the behind-the-scenes documentary about the first Conan film that they clearly went into making it with the understanding they were making a blend of historical fiction and mythology, just like The Frost Giant's Daughter.
I knew nothing of Conan the Barbarian or Robert E. Howard or any of the books or the comic books or anything until Oliver Stone came and told me about it. The one thing I knew about that I was aware of was Frank Frazetta's paintings. And of course, I loved Viking things, and I always wanted to do a Viking movie. And when I was a surfer, one of my first names was Viking Man because I had this great big sword. I did want to bring this back to a certain historical grounding. And I tried to make everything happen in a history as if it really did happen. In fact, all of the stories of Conan, Howard could have written them all and had all of this in the Dark Ages in a real historical period.
Robert Howard, who's a strange bird from Texas, wrote these great stories, most originating in pulp, I believe. He had a great gift for this perverse mythos of darkness and death, and raging and mad Wagnerian mentality.
I started sitting in on some meetings and did some tentative original artwork, kind of starting to visualize the first version of the script, which was very much in the fantasy vein of the Robert Howard novels. With John's massive rewrite, the picture became very action-oriented and less magical, less fantasy, more like an ancient world picture.
Everything has a reflection of something that did exist. Nothing is just designed to be fantasy. It has to look like it would really work.
Long before I first read the script, I had been a Robert E. Howard fan and had read most of the Conan books and most of his other stories as well. And when John said he was going to possibly do this project, we spent a lot of time together discussing all the stuff about the historical things that the characters were patterned after and stuff like that. For instance, my character in Conan, Subotai, was patterned after one of Genghis Khan's Mongol generals. So John Milius and I both did quite a bit of reading on the Mongols.
I think in John Milius' case with Throats of Doom, he researched all the evil men of history and it sort of put them all in one voice. I guess Throats of Doom's metamorphosis into the snake is best taken for granted. In other words, it's best not explained. It is mythology. And any more than you need to explain the unicorn or the satyr, you don't explain Thulsa Snake.
The primary influence for all involved in making that movie was the historical parallels and realism that's in The Frost Giant's Daughter and other Conan stories, despite them being pulpy fantasy adventures with wizards and monsters. I think that choice of direction served the movie quite well. And it's worth noting that I do know Milius liked this story also, because years later he was interested in coming back to make a third Conan film with Arnold Schwarzenegger, which would have continued the blended Viking and Mongol historical epic tone that he had in the first film. That movie was to be called King Conan, Crown of Iron, and it was a partial adaptation of The Frost Giant's Daughter. In Milius's script, Conan meets a frost giant's daughter who lures him to be killed by her frost giant brothers out in the frozen tundra. However, in Milius's script, Ymir never intervenes to save his daughter from Conan, and he impregnates her. The frost giant's daughter then tells Conan that she will not give Conan his son unless he brings to her the jewels of an empire. So this is what motivates Conan to, quote, become a king by his own hand, as the end of Milius's film promises. Conan, motivated by a love for his son, rides out of the frozen north, becomes a warrior general like Genghis Khan, and conquers a mighty empire. The script isn't the greatest thing ever in its form as an early draft, but I think with further revisions it could have been something spectacular. John Milius is known as a compulsive redrafter until he feels that the script is right. He did dozens of rewrites for the Apocalypse Now script before it was filmed. And of course, that film is also about staring into the dark abyss of humanity's ancient psyche. And it's a classic. It's probably my favorite war film of all time. I really like the mythological influence that Howard brings to The Frost Giant's Daughter and the way he uses it as a means to stare into this dark and savage aspect of mankind. Milius did a fantastic job with Apocalypse Now, and that movie's a story about very similar themes, about staring at exactly what humanity is in its horrifying form. If he had taken his interest in Vikings and Norse mythology and synthesize that with the sort of themes he was playing with in Apocalypse Now, I think he could have made a fantastic film. All in all, I have to say that I really enjoyed The Frost Giant's Daughter. I think I'd probably place this one among my favorite Conan stories. At this point, it probably takes the third slot for me, just below Rogues in the House. The story is very short, but Howard manages to pack a lot of thematic depth, exploration of character, and some really cool mythological concepts into its 3,000-word length. It's telling that this story was so influential on the people who made the first Conan film, as John Milius, the director, wrote Apocalypse Now, which is a recontextualized adaptation of the novel Heart of Darkness, also a favorite of mine. The book follows a British sailor who's horrified by the monstrous things he sees as he sails through the Empire's imperial territories in Africa. But we also have the initial screenwriter of the Conan film, Oliver Stone. He directed a film called Platoon, which is also a classic war film and another favorite of mine, that directly adapts his experiences seeing good men turn insane and cruel after living as warriors. These two guys made some of the best films of all time that are a deep dive into what makes school teachers into men like Genghis Khan during war. Their films deal with the implications of what it means to be a man like Conan was in the modern context. But unfortunately, the nature of war has never truly changed. It always has the capacity to bring out the ugliest side of the human psyche. You can see why these two individuals were attracted to a character like Conan, as he is a warrior kept alive by his bestial instincts modern people try and keep a lid on. They were interested in the same themes and aspects of history that fascinated Robert E. Howard years before. Making Conan and the evil of humanity the villain of this story is an inspired choice, and I love how much of a morality play this one is, in the vein of the old myths Howard was inspired by. I would highly recommend this one. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. And so, we've come to the end of yet another episode of Conan Chronicles. This will be the end of my review and retrospective on The Frost Giant's Daughter. I'd like to thank everyone for watching, but before I let you go, I'd like to say a few words regarding how you can experience The Frost Giant's Daughter yourself and support the show if you'd like. In the description below, I've included a link to a free audiobook of The Frost Giant's Daughter that I excerpted in this video. It's done by a channel called The Well-Told Tale, and they always do a fantastic job. I'd highly recommend listening to their version of it. If you really liked the video, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribed to the channel, liked this video, and posted your thoughts on this story, anything I said in the video, or really anything else Conan related in the comments below. All of these sorts of engagements with the video help me get to the top of the YouTube algorithm, so any of those things would definitely help me out quite a bit. I also have a Patreon for Conan Chronicles, where you can support the show monetarily. Any amount you can chip in really helps. And if you haven't seen it yet, I've also put out a trailer for a Patreon podcast that I'm doing with a co-host. It's going to be a more free-form, off-the-cuff discussion podcast about a variety of Conan things. We're going to do movie commentaries, comic book reviews, all of that kind of good stuff. I'm co-hosting it with a friend of mine named Josh, who also really likes Conan. So if you're interested in Conan and want to hear some other content from us, you'll have to subscribe to the Patreon to get access to the full episodes of the Grog House podcast, which is the name that I've arrived at. I thought it was pretty cool. Conan Chronicles is also on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, so if you never want to miss an episode, get updates on the show, and see some awesome pieces of Conan artwork, I would recommend you check out those pages as well. The last thing I'd like to do, dear listener, is invite you to join me for the next episode. In the next show, we're going to be taking a look at the 9th story in Conan's publication history, Iron Shadows in the Moon. But until then, dear listener, I bid you farewell.
Across the red drifts and mail-clad forms, two figures glared at each other. In that utter desolation, only they moved. The frosty sky was over them, the white, illimitable plain around them, the dead men at their feet. Slowly through the corpses they came, as ghosts might come to a tryst through the shambles of a dead world. In the brooding silence, they stood face to face. Both were tall men, built like tigers. Their shields were gone, their corselets battered and dinted. Blood dried on their mail. Their swords were stained red. Their horned helmets showed the marks of fierce strokes. One was beardless and black-maned. The locks and beard of the other were red as the blood on the sunlit snow. "Man," said he, "tell me your name, so that my brothers in Vanaheim may know who was the last of Wulfhere's band to fall before the sword of Heimdall." "Not in Vanaheim," growled the black-haired warrior, "but in Valhalla will you tell your brothers that you met Conan of Cimmeria." Heimdall roared and leapt, and his sword flashed in deathly arc. Conan staggered, and his vision was filled with red sparks as the singing blade crashed on his helmet, shivering into bits of blue fire. But as he reeled, he thrust with all the power of his broad shoulders behind the humming blade. The sharp point tore through brass scales and bones and heart, and the red-haired warrior died at Conan's feet.